The moon hung low in the December sky, its cold light reflecting off the fresh blanket of snow that covered the small suburban neighborhood. Inside the Williamses' home, the air was warm, filled with the faint smell of cinnamon and the soft hum of Christmas music. The tree stood proudly in the corner of the living room, its ornaments gleaming like tiny stars. The peaceful facade was shattered in an instant. A loud crash echoed from upstairs. Ella, the youngest of the three Williams children, screamed, her voice piercing through the calm of the night. Her older brother, Danny, bolted from the couch, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mom, Dad," he shouted, fear taking root as his feet slipped on the polished hardwood floor. The sound of hurried footsteps followed, then silence. Danny froze at the base of the staircase. He could see his father standing at the top, his face pale and contorted in a mix of fear and fury. In his trembling hands, he held an object Danny couldn't make out in the dim light. Behind him, a dark shadow loomed, moving closer. Then, in a single, terrible moment, the shadow lunged. The night turned black. The why of how the Williams family ended up at this harrowing point began months earlier, on a bright and cheerful summer day. The family had always been close-knit, or so it seemed to those who knew them. Mark Williams, the father, was a hard-working man with a knack for fixing anything that broke. His wife, Sarah, was the glue that held the household together, her warm smile a constant source of comfort. The children, Danny, Ella, and middle child Grace, were lively, curious, and full of life. But behind closed doors, cracks had begun to form. It started with Mark's long hours at work. He was a mechanic by trade, but lately, his business had been struggling. Bills piled up, and Sarah had to pick up a part-time job at the local diner. Their arguments grew more frequent, though they always tried to shield the children from their harsh words. One evening, Danny overheard them in the kitchen. "I'm telling you, Mark, we can't keep spending like this." Sarah's voice was strained. "And I'm telling you," Mark shot back. "I'm doing everything I can. Do you think I like seeing my kids go without?" Danny crept away before they noticed him, a knot forming in his stomach. He was only 12, but he could sense something was very wrong. Things took a darker turn when Mark began bringing home strange objects, locks, chains, even a small safe. He claimed they were for projects, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She found him one night, hunched over a notepad, scribbling furiously. When she asked him about it, he snapped, shoving the notepad into a drawer and locking it. Fall came, and with it, a series of unsettling events. Grace's beloved cat, Whiskers, disappeared without a trace. The family searched for days, putting up flyers and calling neighbors, but Whiskers was gone. Grace was devastated, but Mark was uncharacteristically indifferent. "It's just a cat," he muttered one evening as he tinkered with the new lock he'd installed on the basement door. Sarah's unease grew. She began to notice other strange behaviors. Mark would disappear for hours, even on his days off, and he became increasingly secretive about his activities. His temper flared more easily, and the warm, loving man she had married seemed like a stranger. Then came the incident with Ella. One cold November evening, Ella woke up screaming, claiming she had seen someone standing outside her bedroom window. Mark dismissed it as a nightmare, but Sarah wasn't so sure. She noticed footprints in the snow outside the next morning, too large to be a child's. When she showed them to Mark, he brushed her off. "You're being paranoid," he said, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, fear, Sarah couldn't tell. By the time December arrived, the family was hanging by a thread. Sarah had reached out to her sister, Emily, confiding her fears. Emily urged her to leave, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to uproot the children during the holidays. She decided to wait until after Christmas. It was a decision she would come to regret. On Christmas Eve, the Williams family tried to set their troubles aside. They decorated cookies, watched a holiday movie, and exchanged small gifts. For a moment, it felt like the old days. But that night, as the children slept, Sarah confronted Mark. "I found your notepad," she said quietly, holding it up. "What is this, Mark? What are you planning?" Mark's face darkened. "You had no right to go through my things," he said, his voice cold. "You're scaring me, Mark. The locks, the chains, the footprints, what's going on?" Before she could get an answer, a loud noise interrupted them, a thud from upstairs. Sarah ran toward the stairs, Mark close behind. They found Ella's room empty, the window wide open. Snowflakes drifted in, settling on the carpet. Panic set in. Sarah called out for Ella, but there was no response. Danny and Grace woke up, their sleepy faces quickly turning to masks of fear. Together, they searched the house. their voices echoing in the stillness. Then they heard it, a muffled cry from the basement. Mark was the first to reach the locked basement door. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking. When he finally got it open, they were met with a scene that would haunt them forever. Ella was there, tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears. Standing over her was a figure dressed in black, a ski mask covering their face. The intruder turned, revealing a chilling sight, a face that looked eerily familiar. Danny gasped. "Dad." The man in the mask ripped it off, revealing Mark's twin brother. Jack, a man the family thought had disappeared years ago. Jack smirked, his eyes wild. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice dripping with malice. What followed was chaos. Jack lunged at Mark, and the two brothers fought fiercely. Sarah untied Ella, pulling her close as Danny and Grace huddled together. The family managed to escape the basement, locking Jack inside, but the terror wasn't over. Mark revealed the truth. Jack had come to him months ago, demanding money. When Mark refused, Jack began stalking the family, leaving the footprints, killing Whiskers, and ultimately planning to harm them. But Jack wasn't finished. They could hear him pounding on the basement door, shouting threats. The police arrived just in time, arresting Jack and bringing the nightmare to an end. Or so they thought. As the Williams family tried to move on, they couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's presence still lingered. They would later find notes he had hidden around the house, promising that he would return. And on the next Christmas Eve, a single gift appeared under the tree, wrapped in black paper with no name attached. Inside was a note. "You can't lock out family. See you soon." The Williams family didn't sleep that night. Mark checked the locks repeatedly while Sarah held the children close. The police were called again, but there was little they could do. "Jack is in custody," the officer assured them over the phone. "This is probably a cruel prank, but we'll investigate." Mark wasn't convinced. He spent the night pacing the house, gripping the baseball bat he had brought up from the basement. Every creak of the house made him jump, and the eerie silence outside didn't help. Snow blanketed the neighborhood, muffling even the faintest sounds, making the world feel unnervingly still. By morning, the family was exhausted but relieved when nothing else happened. The ominous gift remained unopened on the kitchen counter, as if staring back at them. Mark event. Ally took it outside and burned it in the fire pit, watching as the flames devoured the note and the black paper. But the sense of unease lingered. The following weeks were a blur of paranoia and fear. Mark took time off work to install a security system, complete with cameras and motion detectors. Sarah, on the other hand, took the children to stay with her sister Emily for a while, hoping distance from the house would help them feel safe. It didn't. Even at Emily's house, strange things began to happen. A knock on the door late at night revealed no one there. A window was found cracked open. Though Sarah was certain she had locked it, Emily dismissed it as coincidence, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was still watching them. Meanwhile, back at the Williams home, Mark grew increasingly paranoid. He barely slept, keeping vigil in the living room with the baseball bat always within reach. One night, as he reviewed the security footage, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At exactly 3 a.m., the camera at the front porch recorded a faint shadow moving across the snow. It was brief, no more than a flicker, but it was enough to confirm his worst fears. Someone was out there. Mark didn't tell Sarah right away, not wanting to alarm her further. Instead, he contacted the police again. They reviewed the footage but found it inconclusive. It could be an animal. One officer suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "We'll increase patrols in the area, just in case." A month passed without incident, and the family slowly began to let their guard down. Sarah and the kids returned home, and life started to feel normal again. They even managed to laugh during a family game night, the first time in weeks that the house felt alive with joy. But on a chilly February evening, everything unraveled. Danny was the first to notice something was wrong. He had been up late working on a school project when he heard a faint tapping noise coming from the kitchen. At first, he thought it was the wind rattling the windows. But when the noise didn't stop, he decided to investigate. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the streetlight outside. Danny squinted, trying to see the source of the noise. That's when he saw it. A handprint on the outside of the window, smeared as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass and dragged it down. "Dad!" Danny yelled, his voice cracking with fear. Mark was there in seconds, followed closely by Sarah. They both froze when they saw the handprint. It was too large to belong to any of the children, and the smudges around it suggested whoever had left it had been wearing gloves. Mark grabbed the baseball bat and flung open the back door, scanning the yard. Snow. runched under his boots as he stepped outside, but there was no sign of anyone. The handprint was the only clue, standing out starkly against the frost-covered window. That night, no one slept. Mark stayed up, watching the cameras, while Sarah kept the children in her bedroom, locking the door. The sense of safety they had been rebuilding was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that Jack, or someone just as dangerous, was still out there. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, on a stormy night in March. The family had just finished dinner when the power suddenly went out. Darkness engulfed the house, and the only sound was the howling wind outside. Mark quickly grabbed a flashlight and began checking the fuse box. Sarah lit candles, trying to keep the children calm, though her hands trembled. Danny and Grace clung to each other, while Ella cried softly. As Mark worked in the basement, he heard a noise above him, a faint creak, as if someone was walking across the floor. He froze, his flashlight beam trembling as he listened. Another creak, this time louder. Mark's heart pounded. He knew the sound well. It was the floorboard just outside the living room, the one that always groaned when stepped on. "Sarah," he called, his voice tight. No answer. Mark bolted up the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He found Sarah and the children in the dining room, huddled together. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone's in the house," Mark said, gripping the bat so tightly his knuckles turned white. Before Sarah could respond, T.H.E.Y. heard it, a door slamming shut upstairs. Mark motioned for Sarah to stay put while he crept toward the staircase. Every step felt like an eternity. When he reached the top, he was met with silence. He checked each room, his flashlight sweeping across walls and furniture, but found nothing. And then, as he turned to leave Ella's room, he saw it. A single note, taped to the inside of her closet door. "I told you I'd be back." The Williams family moved out the next day. They left behind the house, their belongings, and any hope of reclaiming their normal lives. The case remained open, with no definitive proof that Jack had returned. But Mark and Sarah knew the truth. Somewhere out there, Jack was watching. And he wasn't done yet. The Williams family relocated to a small, remote town 2 hours away, where they hoped to escape the terror that had haunted them. They rented a modest house on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by tall pines and far removed from prying eyes. The children enrolled in new schools. Sarah found part-time work at a local bakery, and Mark began offering freelance mechanical work. They tried to piece their lives back together. For a while, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter. The silence in their new home was peaceful rather than menacing, and the family began to heal. Danny even made a new friend at school, a boy named Eric, who shared his love of video games and basketball. Grace joined a book club, and Ella started sleeping through the night again. But the peace didn't last. One evening in late April, Sarah was cleaning up after dinner when she noticed something peculiar. On the windowsill outside the kitchen, there was a faint, smeared mark, almost like a fingerprint. She brushed it off as dirt from the wind, but a chill ran down her spine. Mark dismissed her concern. "It's probably nothing," he said, though his eyes betrayed his own unease. He didn't mention that he had seen a similar mark on the side of the garage earlier that week. That night, Sarah dreamed of their old house, of the dark basement and the shadowy figure of Jack. She woke up in a cold sweat, the image of his wild eyes burned into her memory. The following morning, she decided to tell Mark. "I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched," she confessed over coffee. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "I've felt it too, but there's no proof, Sarah. We can't keep living like this. What if he followed us? What if he's in prison?" Mark interrupted, his voice firm. "We checked before we moved. He's still locked up." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She began noticing small things, a shoeprint in the mud outside their house after a rainstorm, a misplaced kitchen chair, the sound of footsteps outside late at night. Each time she told Mark, he assured her it was her imagination. One night in May, Mark decided to check the security cameras he had installed around their new home. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the wind rustling the trees and a few deer wandering through the yard. But then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the motion detector picked up something. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, just barely visible in the shadows. It was impossible to make out any features, but the person stood still for several minutes, staring directly at the house. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they turned and walked into the woods. Mark's stomach dropped. He didn't wake Sarah or the kids. Instead, he stayed up all night, watching the footage on a loop, hoping to convince himself it was a trick of the light. But he knew better. The next day, Mark reported the incident to the local police. The officer who came to their house was polite but unconcerned. "It's probably a drifter passing through," he said. "We'll keep an eye out. But this is a quiet town. Nothing much happens here." Mark wasn't satisfied. He began patrolling the property himself each night, armed with a flashlight and a wrench he carried in his back pocket. He even considered buying a gun, though Sarah was vehemently against it. Weeks passed without further incidents, and Mark started to relax, until one morning when Danny came running into the house. Pale and trembling. "Dad," he stammered, "you need to see this." Mark followed Danny outside, where the boy pointed to the side of the house. Scratched into T. Wood siding were 3 words: "I found you." Panic gripped the family once more. Mark called the police again, but without any solid evidence, there was little they could do. Could it be kids playing a prank? The officer asked, though his tone suggested even he didn't believe it. Sarah wanted to leave, but Mark refused. "We can't keep running," he said. "We need to face this." That night, he stayed up again, watching the cameras and patrolling the house. He didn't see or hear anything unusual, but when he woke up the next morning, he found another message carved into the back door. "Merry Christmas, Mark." It was the middle of June. The messages continued sporadically over the next few months. Sometimes they were carved into wood, other times, they were scrawled in chalk "N" the driveway or written in red paint on the mailbox. The words were always taunting, always personal. Mark's mental state began to unravel. He grew irritable and withdrawn, snapping at Sarah and the kids over small things. He stopped sleeping entirely, consumed by the need to catch whoever was tormenting them. Sarah worried he was becoming as unhinged as Jack. Then, in early September, everything came to a head. The family returned home one evening after a trip to the grocery store to find their front door ajar. Mark immediately told Sarah and the kids to stay outside while he went in to investigate. He found the living room in shambles, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered, and the Christmas ornament box they had stored in the attic dumped out across the floor. On the wall, written in bold red letters, was a chilling message: "It's almost time." Mark's knees buckled. He knew exactly what it meant. Christmas was only 3 months away. That night, the Williams family left the house for good, abandoning everything they owned. They moved to an undisclosed location, their whereabouts known only to the police. But even as they tried to rebuild their lives once more, they lived in constant fear, knowing that Jack, or whoever was behind the torment, was still out there, waiting. And every December, they would wake up on Christmas morning, dreading the possibility of finding another black-wrapped gift under the tree. The Williams family moved to a remote cabin deep in the mountains, far from neighbors, cities, and anything that felt like civilization. Mark had decided that the only way to keep his family safe was to disappear entirely. They changed their last name, disconnected from all forms of communication, and avoided anything that could lead someone to their location. For a while, it worked. The isolation was suffocating at first, but over time, it brought a strange kind of peace. The children adjusted to homeschooling, Sarah busied herself with gardening and cooking. And Mark spent his days fortifying the cabin, installing reinforced doors, setting up traps in the surrounding woods, and building an underground shelter just in case. Months passed without incident, and the family began to believe they had finally escaped the nightmare. As Christmas approached, the family debated whether to celebrate. Sarah wanted to keep some sense of normalcy for the children. But Mark was adamant. "No tree, no lights, no gifts," he said firmly. "We're not giving him any reason to find us." But Sarah refused to let fear dictate their lives anymore. On Christmas Eve, while Mark was out checking the perimeter, she quietly brought out a small box of decorations she had managed to save. She and the children decorated the fireplace mantel with a few garlands and placed a single candle in the window. "It's just for tonight," she told them. "A little light in the darkness." Mark was furious when he returned, but he didn't have the heart to take it down. Instead, he sat in the corner of the room, gripping his shotgun and staring at the candle's flickering flame as the rest of the family sang carols in hushed voices. That night, as the family slept, Mark stayed awake, watching the snowy forest through the window. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the old cabin. He tried to convince himself that they were safe, that Jack couldn't possibly find them here. But around midnight, the wind shifted, and Mark's breath caught. He thought he heard something, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on snow. He strained his ears, but the sound was gone. He shook his head, blaming his exhausted mind, and continued his vigil. An hour later, the motion detector near the front door beeped softly. Mark froze. He grabbed the shotgun and moved toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The detector had never gone off before. It wasn't sensitive to animals or falling snow. He peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. Cautiously, he opened the door and stepped outside. The cold bit at his skin as he scanned the area with a flashlight. At first, everything seemed normal. Then he saw them. Footprints. Fresh, human footprints, leading from the edge of the woods to the front porch. They stopped right where he was standing. Mark turned and rushed back inside, bolting the door behind him. He woke Sarah, whispering urgently, "He's here. Take the kids to the shelter." Sarah's face paled, but she didn't argue. She gathered the children and led them to the trapdoor in the pantry that led to the underground shelter. "Stay quiet," Mark instructed as he closed the door behind them. Mark positioned himself in the living room, shotgun ready, and waited. Hours passed, but the night remained eerily still. Just as dawn was breaking, Mark's exhaustion began to catch up with him. His eyes drooped, and the gun felt heavier in his hands. Then he heard it, a soft knock at the back door. Mark's blood ran cold. He crept toward the door, his finger trembling on the trigger. The knock came again, louder this time. Taking a deep breath, Mark flung the door open, aiming the shotgun into the frosty morning air. No one was there, but on the ground, just outside the door, was a small black gift box wrapped with a red ribbon. Mark stared at it, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to kick it away, to destroy it, but curiosity got the better of him. With shaking hands, he picked it up and peeled back the ribbon. Inside was a folded piece of paper. It read, "You can run, but you can't hide. See you next Christmas." Mark slammed the door shut and locked it, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He didn't tell Sarah or the kids about the box. Instead, he burned it in the fireplace and resolved to take his family even deeper into hiding. But no matter how far they ran, the threat followed them. Every Christmas, without fail, a black wrapped gift would appear, on a doorstep, in the woods. Even inside the house once. The messages were always the same. Taunting, threatening, promising that Jack, or someone just as sinister, was still watching. The family lived in constant fear, their lives consumed by the shadow of the past. And though they changed locations and identities countless times, they could never shake the feeling that no matter where they went, the nightmare was never far behind. Because some evils don't stay locked away. Some evils always find a way back. As the years went by, the Williams family, now the Millers, tried to move forward. But the weight of their fear remained ever present. The children grew older, their once bright smiles dulled by years of running and hiding. Mark and Sarah, once hopeful and full of life, became hardened and distant. Their marriage strained by the endless cycle of uncertainty. One Christmas Eve, 10 years after the first black gift had appeared, the family found themselves in yet another remote cabin, this time high in the Rockies. Snow blanketed the landscape, and the isolation was complete. The children, now young adults, had stopped asking about the strange packages that haunted their lives. They knew better than to speak of them. Mark sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his shotgun resting on his lap. Sarah was in the kitchen, quietly preparing a simple meal. Danny, Grace, and Ella were in their rooms, each lost in their own thoughts. The cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Then it happened. A loud knock echoed through the cabin. Mark shot up, his heart racing. Sarah froze, the knife slipping from her hand onto the counter. Danny and Grace emerged from their rooms, their faces pale. Ella appeared last, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. "No," Mark muttered, "not again." This time, he wasn't afraid. He was angry. For 10 years, this nightmare had stolen their peace, their happiness, their lives. He wasn't going to let it happen anymore. "Stay here," he said firmly, gripping his shotgun as he moved toward the door. "Mark, don't," Sarah pleaded, but he didn't stop. Mark flung the door open, his shotgun raised, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was tormenting his family. But the porch was empty. The snow lay undisturbed, save for a single black gift box resting neatly in the center. Mark hesitated, his breath visible in the icy air. Slowly, he lowered the gun and bent to pick up the box. He carried it inside and set it on the dining table. The rest of the family gathered around, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What does it say?" Sarah whispered. Mark opened the box. Inside was a piece of paper, just like before. But this time, the message was different. It read, "The game is over. You won. Merry Christmas." The room fell silent. They stared at the note, unsure of what to make of it. Mark turned it over, but there was nothing on the back. The handwriting was the same, Jack's, but the tone was different. Is this real? Grace asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He walked to the fireplace and threw the note into the flames. They watched as it curled and blackened, turning to ash. For the first time in years, no other messages appeared. No packages, no threats, no signs of Jack or anyone else. The family stayed in the cabin for the rest of the winter. Wary but cautiously hopeful, by spring, they began to believe it was finally over. Years later, on another snowy Christmas Eve, Danny, now a father himself, sat with his own family in front of a roaring fire. His wife and 2 children laughed as they opened gifts, the warmth and joy of the season filling the room. As the evening wore on, Danny stepped outside to admire the snow-covered landscape. The cold air was refreshing, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. But just as he turned to go back inside, he noticed something on the porch, a small black gift box, tied with a red ribbon. Danny stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he bent down, picked it up, and opened it. Inside was a single note. It read, "Merry Christmas. You can't escape family." Danny's heart sank. He looked around, but the night was still and quiet. The nightmare wasn't over. It never would be. Danny's hands trembled as he clutched the note, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. He glanced around the yard, scanning the shadows under the trees and the moonlit driveway, but everything was silent. The faint sound of his children's laughter drifted from inside the house, a sharp contrast to the dread pooling in his chest. He wanted to believe it was a prank, a cruel joke played by a neighbor or someone who'd stumbled across the story of his family's past. But deep down, he knew better. The handwriting was unmistakable, the words too deliberate to be coincidence. Danny stepped back into the house, forcing a smile for his wife and children. He slipped the box into his coat pocket and resolved not to say anything that night. No sense in scaring them, he thought. But the weight of the note stayed with him, gnawing at his mind. Later that night, as his family slept, Danny sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. The note sat on the coffee table in front of him, taunting him with its simplicity. "Merry Christmas. You can't escape family." He wanted to burn it, to destroy it like his father had done so many years ago. But something stopped him. He needed answers. If Jack, or someone else, was still out there, Danny couldn't let this cycle of terror continue. The next morning, while his wife and children played in the snow, Danny made a call to his father. Mark answered on the second ring, his voice gruff but steady. "Danny, is everything okay?" "No, Dad," Danny said, keeping his voice low. "It's back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" Mark finally asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "A black box. Last night. Same handwriting." Mark sighed heavily. "It's been quiet for so long. I thought it was over." "So did I. But it's not." Danny's voice hardened. "Dad, I need to know everything. What really happened to Jack?" Mark hesitated. "Danny, I told you. Jack was arrested. He spent years in prison, and then what? He died," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 years after his sentence. Heart attack. Danny felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. "You're telling me Jack is dead?" "Yes," Mark said firmly. "He's gone. Whoever is behind this, it's not him." "Then who?" Danny demanded. "And why now? Why won't this end?" "I don't know," Mark said. "But you can't let it control you. That's what they want. Fear, chaos. You have to protect your family, no matter what." Danny clenched his jaw. "I will." Over the next few weeks, Danny became increasingly vigilant. He installed security cameras around the property, reinforced the locks, and set up motion sensors in the yard. But the sense of unease never left him. Then, just as he began to think the note was an isolated incident, the messages started appearing. The first was scribbled in chalk on the sidewalk outside his house, "Still watching." The second was carved into the bark of a tree near the backyard, "Family first." And the third was a photograph, slipped under his front door in the dead of night. It showed Danny's wife and children, taken from outside their window. Danny's breaking point came one night in early February, when he awoke to the sound of footsteps in the attic. Grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat, he crept upstairs, his heart pounding. The footsteps stopped as he reached the top, and the attic was eerily silent. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the space, but it revealed only dusty boxes and cobwebs. Then, as he turned to leave, he saw it. In the center of the floor was another black box. Inside was a photograph of his family, taken years ago, back at the original Williams home. Written on the back were 3 words, "We never left." Danny called his father the next morning. his voice shaking as he recounted what had happened. "Dad, I'm scared. I don't know what to do." Mark's voice was steady but grim. "Danny, listen to me. You can't run. You have to face this." "How? I don't even know who's behind it." "Then you find out," Mark said. "You end it. For good." Danny took his father's advice. He began investigating his family's past, digging into old police reports and court records, desperate to find any clue. He even visited Jack's gravesite, half expecting to find it empty, but it wasn't. Jack was truly dead, but as Danny delved deeper, he uncovered something chilling. Jack hadn't been working alone. The police records mentioned an accomplice, someone who had helped Jack plan the torment of the Williams family all those years ago. The accomplice was never identified, but the reports suggested they were close to Jack, someone who shared his twisted sense of loyalty to family. The realization hit Danny like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about Jack, it was about his legacy, a dark, relentless force that refused to let go. Danny knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep running, couldn't let this shadow haunt his family any longer. He would find the person responsible and put an end to it, once and for all. But as he prepared for the fight ahead, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. What if the accomplice wasn't a stranger? What if it was someone closer than he realized? And as another Christmas approached, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Danny's search for answers came to a head on Christmas Eve. The snow fell in thick sheets outside, muffling every sound as he sat in his study, reviewing the files he had gathered. He had tracked down names, addresses, and possible leads. But one connection kept appearing, a former neighbor from his childhood, a man named Victor Barnes. Victor had been close to Jack, almost like an older brother, and had disappeared shortly after Jack's arrest. Danny had dismissed it at first. Victor had no known criminal record and had seemed kind enough back then. But the more he dug, the more he realized Victor had been hiding in plain sight. Reports of someone matching his description had surfaced near the Williams family's old home and their previous hiding places. Danny couldn't ignore the pattern. That night, as his family slept, Danny made a decision. He wasn't going to let another Christmas be ruined. He grabbed his keys, drove through the storm to the address he had found for Victor, and prepared for a confrontation. The house was an old, decrepit cabin on the outskirts of town. Danny's heart pounded as he approached the door, his flashlight cutting through the dark. He knocked once, twice, but there was no answer. He was about to leave when he noticed something glinting in the snow near the side of the house. It was another black box. Danny's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a photograph of his family, taken that very night. Written on the back was the message, "Too late." Panic gripped him. He raced back to his car and sped home, the storm blurring his vision in. The sense of dread growing with every passing second. When he arrived, he burst through the door, shouting for his wife and children. They were gone. The house was eerily quiet, the faint smell of pine and cinnamon lingering in the air. On the mantel, where Sarah had placed the single candle earlier that evening, was a note. "Family always finds its way back. Merry Christmas." Danny's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had failed. The shadow that had haunted his family for decades had won. And as the clock struck midnight, Danny knew he would never see his family again. Thank you for joining us for this chilling story, a Christmas tragedy, the chilling story of a family wiped out by one of their own. If you enjoyed this tale of suspense and terror, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. What do you think happened to Danny's family? Was Victor the accomplice, or was it someone even closer? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you have a story idea or a request for our next video, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Stay safe, and remember, some secrets are better left buried. Until next time.